Good evening, dear friends. We've been moving through Advent. First Sunday in Advent, we looked at the mineral kingdom. And the second Sunday, the plant kingdom. This evening, we'll be looking at the animal kingdom. And first of all, just trying to get a bit of a glimpse of the nature of the animal itself, or you might say the animal nature of creation. Before I do that, I'd like to introduce one of my little animal friends here. His name is Lamb of God. You can see he's a lamb created by my dear friend Joya. I don't know if she's watching right now or not. He lives in Santa Cruz and makes all sorts of wonderful creations out of wool. And Lamb of God has been with me for 4 or 5 years now, I think. It always reminds me that the animal nature is something to be appreciated, to be loved, to be respected, sometimes to be managed. You might say, as a human being, we have the responsibility, as it was given already to Adam, way back in the book of Genesis, to be the caretaker of the natural world, including the animals. So all of us who have an animal or animals in our lives, or have had animals, have a sense of what it can mean to be in relationship to that particular dog, cat, rabbit, cow, horse, whatever it might be. Some forces, some kind of energy flows back and forth between you and that animal. And one can get very sentimental about them. It can be make them kind of into people. And without offending anybody, I have to say I have a slight aversion to seeing dogs and cats dressed up with clothes and hats and things. But okay, that's me. Go ahead and do it if you like. And then you can say, as we build this appreciation of the natural world through the time of Advent, we can recognize that the mineral kingdom is really just mineral kingdom. As soon as you move into the plant kingdom, you have living beings who embody the mineral kingdom within themselves, but you might say a new aspect is added or comes into being. Life, a certain amount of movement, internal movement, a certain amount of outside, inside. The plant has boundaries. And then we move farther into the animal kingdom, and we see that the animal has aspects of the mineral kingdom. The animal has a body. You can touch it and feel it and pet it, stroke it, give it a hug. It's there. And the animal also embodies this aspect of outside and inside, perhaps stronger than the plant. The inside world of the animal is much more complicated. The whole digestive process, the living process, the breathing process, the perception is something that animals have very differently than plants. I remember back in the 60s or so, people began to talk about how plants would react to their surroundings. And it got a little human back then too. People would say, yeah, my plant loves me and my plant knows when I come home. Maybe. It's true. If you set a plant facing the sun this way, all the leaves grow in that direction. If you turn the plant around, the leaves will again incline themselves to the sun. I would not necessarily say that is a perception the same way that animals perceive. Animals who have eyes and ears, in the first place, senses that can connect them to the world around them in a very specific way. We know, for example, that dogs don't really see all that sharply. They detect movement with their eyes. And having owned dogs that were very sensitive to other animals, especially as herding dogs or hunting dogs, they only had to see something moving and they were gone. It didn't matter what it was, they were gone. The dog's sense of smell is very fine, very refined. And so we see that the animal kingdom adds a number of aspects, becomes much more complicated than the plant. We'll get to the human beings next week, but I do have to say something about the relationship of the human being to the animal, plant, and mineral world. Namely, the human being adds another aspect, that inner nature that we call the I, or the ego, or the self. Again, we'll talk about that next week. This is an aspect that the mineral, the plant, and the animal do not have within themselves. One can say that the great I of the mineral kingdom, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom surrounds those beings, guides them from outside. The animal, we often think, has a soul. And especially dogs and cats, animals that live very closely together with human beings, it's quite tempting to assign certain human characteristics to the animal, because they can look at you very directly. They can react quite sensitively to the moods, to the movements, to the actions of their human beings. They often seem to know when you're feeling happy or a little sad. They become very sad when you're not there. Cats don't, they don't care. But dogs, as far as the dog knows, you're never coming back. And no wonder they're so happy when you come back. Tail wagging, whole body wagging, jumping up and down, squawking and barking and yelping. And it's very tempting to say, well, the dog has a soul. The dog has this inner nature, this inner ability to express itself. And there is something to that. I believe that the dog does not have an individual soul, but there, again, it's often called a group soul, that we might say all of the sheep, there is a group soul, sheep, a great being, sheep, who watches over all of the individual sheeps and guides them and stimulates them and determines their behavior. There might be group souls for the individual breeds of dogs. I don't really know that. But the idea that a dog or a cat or a rabbit or a hamster, that those individual bodies that we see and that we love, we like to play with and work with, those are connected to a greater whole. In other words, much more than human beings, our dogs are connected to all the other dogs in the world. If you walk with your dog in the park, most of the time the dogs will be very direct about going toward each other, sniffing and mostly sniffing. They don't really look all that much. They use their sense of smell to determine whether that other dog is a friend or an enemy. And of course, dog owners among us know what that's like. If they decide they're friends, they could get the leashes untangled and have a ball. If they're enemies, you just have to walk on. But the sense of smell determines a lot for the dog. And so these senses are specialized. Where most of us human beings have a sense of sight and smell, taste, touch, and so on, the dogs are very specialized. The cats are very specialized. And here we arrive at one of the more difficult, at least for me, one of the most difficult concepts that I encountered when I was getting to know the anthroposophy brought to the world by Rudolf Steiner. And that is contrary to what the conventional theory of evolution says, namely, that the human being is the highest being, and it is evolved out of the lower beings from some sort of slimy creatures in the watery worlds all the way up to the higher animals, the monkeys, who look a little bit like people, right up to people. Whereas Rudolf Steiner comes and says the whole point of the current phase of evolution and development is the human being. And when we say current phase of evolution, we're talking many hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years back, to a time, a period, where the human being was nothing but warmth. And the only distinction between you and me were differences of warmth. This lasted for a long time, until the human being moved into another phase and began to distinguish light and dark. And then into another phase where it began to experience what we might call feelings or emotions or reactions to each other. And each time the human being went through one of these phases, certain aspects of that human being were discarded, so to speak, set out into the world. It might have been that extreme sense of smell. It might have been that extreme ability to run fast, or to chase, or to distinguish friend from foe. The one-sidedness of the various types of animals were set out into the world and developed in their own way, while the human being continued to develop as a whole, as a being that encompasses many, many, many qualities. And so we hear at a certain point in the evolution, certain types of human beings began to emerge. And we might remember from our work with the apocalypse a few months ago that in this vision in heaven, John rose up into the spiritual world and saw a throne, 24 thrones around this throne, the 7 spirits of life, or the Elohim, before the throne, and in the midst of the throne, 4 creatures, 4 zoein, living beings. Our British friends often call them beasts, and Americans have a bit of difficulty with that word. We often think of very nasty animals when we think of beasts. The 4 living creatures, the 4 living beings, one of whom resembles a lion, another resembles a bull, another resembles an eagle, and the 4th resembles a human being. And Rudolf Steiner tells us that at a certain point in our development as human beings, certain types of human beings began to emerge and to distinguish themselves from other types of human beings. The lion people, the bull people, the eagle people, and those that were purely human. We find these back in the those symbolic representations of the 4 Gospels: the human being or the angel for Matthew, the lion for Mark, the bull or the steer for Luke, and the eagle, or as some of us love very much, the scorpion, for the Gospel of John. You'll see these frequently in churches, displayed often in the cross, where the two naves cross. You'll see the 4 animals, the 4 living beings, sometimes up high, sometimes lower. And these 4 types of beings, if you look around, and now we're already moving a little bit into the human realm, if you look around, and not to place labels or to make types out of people, but you will distinguish certain temperaments among human beings. And these are often related to part of our animal nature. Someone who's very brave, very outgoing, very, very forthright, we could see as a kind of a lion type of person. Someone who takes their time, who ruminates, who with every question that's asked them and every remark that's made toward them, they have to let it go back and forth and back and forth You think of the bovine animal, the steer, the cow, with its many stomachs, where all of its food goes back and forth and back and forth. We might think these are kind of the steer, the bull type of people. And then you have those eagle folks, sharp eyes. They're able to rise up above the fray and often have a very good overview. And then we also have those just people who seem to have perhaps no terribly special aspects or talents or qualities, but they're a people person. You know that expression, people person. That's very wonderful. If you go to Wikipedia, which I did today, I have to admit, I couldn't resist. I didn't have the time to go through the entire Bible and look for every place where animals are mentioned. But if you do the Wikipedia search and you simply say Bibles in the animal, you come up with a very long list of places where the animal appears in one story or another. And we need to remember that in biblical times, the human beings and the animals were not that far apart. Nature was not as far removed from life in the city or the village as it is now. People didn't make as much noise. They didn't have electric lights. They didn't have 5G. And all of those things that typically disturb the natural state of plants and animals. And so it was much easier to make a comparison if one of the prophets or Jesus or later the apostles were teaching. They would often take the example of a particular animal. And so I was just reading the Gospel of Luke earlier, and just perhaps as a last example of the beauty, actually, of the comparison to the animal kingdom. This was in the 13th chapter, where Jesus is on the road to Jerusalem. And that could have a sort of an ominous tone in our ear, on the road to Jerusalem, going to meet his ultimate fate, or the ultimate transformation. And he's ruminating, you might say, about how human beings have treated the prophets and all of those who brought heaven closer to earth. And he says at a certain point, calls out, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, why have you done these things? I wish that I could take you under my wings as a hen takes her brood under her wings. But O Jerusalem, O Jerusalem. And we realize that Jerusalem, full of human beings, those with a free will, have gone their own way. And the mother hen is not able to keep her brood under her wings. But this typical comparison that a biblical speaker uses shows us how close to the soul of human beings, to the daily life of human beings, the animal kingdom was at that point. We often hear the foxes have holes, the birds have nests, but the son of humanity has nowhere to lay his head. And there again we see something very typical of the animal kingdom. The foxes have their holes, fixed places where perhaps a family of fox has lived for generations. And the nest built in the tree or on a cliff is a magnificent artistic construction made by a bird. It may not last for centuries or generations or even 1 year, but if you ever get to look at a bird's nest, you'll see how solid it is, how well constructed to hold a family, to hold the eggs, to allow the mother bird to brood her eggs. And so we see that the animal kingdom has a number of characteristics that are very fixed. They don't change. Many can be trained, dogs, cats, and so on. But we always work on their habit bodies. We work on their ability to respond to stimulus. And they're trained. They love to do what they do because it becomes part of their natural rhythms. And we human beings, we always want something different. And I'll be looking at that a week from now. I wish you a blessed third Advent Sunday, third week in Advent time, and see you next week.